I'd like to move on now to another kind of meditation, which is compassion meditation, generating feelings of kindness and compassion toward oneself and toward others. And this really is asking the question whether the two constituents of well-being that I talked about earlier, positive outlook and generosity, can be nurtured through this kind of practice. And so we speculated early on that this might be the case. This is a review article that I wrote with Bruce McEwen in 2012, and just reading the last line of the abstract here, we said structural and functional changes in the brain have been observed with cognitive therapy and certain forms of meditation and lead to the suggestion that well-being and other pro-social characteristics might be enhanced through training. And so let me give you just one snippet of evidence for that. So this is a study that was published a couple of years ago. The first author is Helen Wang, who is now a postdoc at UCSF. She was a graduate student in our lab at the time. And we asked the question whether 2 weeks of training, and I'll give you a feel for what this training is in just a moment, in a randomized controlled trial where participants signed up and were told that this is a study about interventions designed to cultivate well-being, and you will be randomly assigned to one of two interventions. One is a condition that utilizes this compassion meditation practice that I'll describe, and the second were procedures that were derived from cognitive therapy, one of the most empirically well-validated strategies for treating anxiety and depression and cultivating well-being. These interventions were delivered over the internet. Participants logged on to a protected website, and by the way, you can go to our website and download this training for free, and you can get a taste of exactly what we presented to the participants. So they had a daily practice of 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks, and one of the virtues of delivering this online is that we can monitor exactly what they were doing, and the comparison group was taught cognitive reappraisal training. So the elements of this compassion training were this. We asked people to contemplate and visualize the suffering, and then relieving that suffering, being free of that suffering for a number of different categories of individuals. We first had them focus on a loved one. So in this case, a family member or a very close friend, someone with whom they have an uncomplicated relationship, could even be a pet, an animal. We asked them to focus on this individual and envision a time in that individual's life when she or he may have been suffering, and then cultivate the aspiration that they be relieved from that suffering. We then had them move on to themselves, to a stranger, a person whose face you recognize, but someone you don't know very well. Could be someone who works as a cashier in a cafe that you go to on a regular basis. It could be a bus driver. It could be any number of individuals, someone who lives, a neighbor who you don't know very well. So a stranger, and just imagine a time in their life when they may have been suffering and go through this same process. Finally, we have them move on to a difficult person, someone who pushes your buttons at least a little bit, someone who makes you a little bit irritated. And again, genuinely and authentically bring that individual into your mind and your heart and go through this process. And finally, as many individuals as possible, all beings. And we have them use a phrase that they silently repeat to themselves to help them. May you be free from suffering. May you experience joy and ease. We then instruct them to notice visceral sensations that may be associated with this. Often people report sensations around the heart. And we instruct them to feel the compassion emotionally and not to simply repeat the phrases cognitively. And the way this experiment went is we randomized participants to either a compassion group or a reappraisal group. We brought them into the lab and gave them, had them go through an fMRI scan where we were specifically interrogating circuitry associated with emotion and empathy. And we had them go then through training, 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks. And then we had them come back for a second MRI scan. And at that time, we also gave them some behavioral/neuroeconomic decision-making tasks to get an objective measure of pro-social or altruistic behavior. So that's the basic experimental design, and participants were randomly assigned to these groups, having signed up again for an experiment that they knew would involve one of two interventions designed to cultivate well-being. So this is the economic game that we used, and I won't go through this in detail, but it's a version of the dictator game, but it involves a third party who is observing the interaction between a dictator and a recipient. And when the dictator makes an unfair transaction and basically is giving much less to the recipient than otherwise might occur, the third party, who is our subject in this case, has the opportunity to use some of her or his own money to render that transaction to be more altruistic. So that's the basic logic of this game. And after 2 weeks of compassion training, participants randomly assigned to the compassion group behave more altruistically on this economic decision-making task compared to those who go through the cognitive reappraisal training. And with respect to the brain, it turns out that there are changes in the brain that occur from time 1 to time 2 over the course of this 2 weeks, functional changes in the brain that predict the extent to which the participants are behaving prosocially, with greater changes, in this case, in prefrontal and parietal cortices predicting changes in altruistic behavior, increases in altruistic behavior for the compassion group compared to the reappraisal group. We also see changes in important circuitry that we've identified in other basic studies as being critical to this positive outlook feature of well-being and is associated with psychological measures of well-being, and that is the connectivity between prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, in this case specifically the nucleus accumbens, which is strengthened by compassion training compared to reappraisal training.